By the end of this video, I want you to understand two more main and common destroyers of modern society. But first, as always, subscribe and stick around to the end to implement these tips and tricks into your life. Now, I made a recent video on the three main and common destroyers of modern society, but I realized after the video that there were two more that I'd missed out that I didn't really want to put in the section of the advanced destroyers of modern society, so I thought I'd make an extra video on it. And the first, or really the fourth, main and common destroyer of modern society is sugar, and I'm surprised that I forgot to talk about this in the previous video that I made, considering how much I do talk about it on the channel and how passionate I am against it. But when I realised that I'd forgotten about it, I contemplated putting it in the advanced destroyer of modern society section, but because I realised that people do actually know that sugar is bad for their health, but they are sort of just coping because it's quite addictive, I realised that this is something that's quite main and common in society and needs to be talked about as if it is such. And as I said before, many people cope with the fact that sugar's not actually that bad for them, even though they know it is, and that's simply because sugar is quite potent of a drug. It's quite a big stimulant, and it makes you quite energetic initially before you then have a sugar crash, and it's quite stimulating. It's very potent, it releases a lot of dopamine, and it's very, very addictive. Yet people don't really know this because it's so common in society. That's hence why I put it in this video, because it's so common and so widespread. Yet it's really addictive, and while it may not be as potent and as addictive as something like nicotine or alcohol or whatever, it is something that's definitely worth talking about as an addictive substance. And you've probably heard of something called binge eating, where people will eat so much sugary snacks and chocolates and crisps and just snacky things in general, like biscuits or whatever, and they will ravenously and violently eat and search for more of this stuff, because the problem is that these people often don't understand that sugar is not a very satiating food, and once you eat a meal or a snack that's high in sugar, the hunger is going to return maybe an hour later, and then you're going to want to eat or buy more and more and more sugary snacks and snacky type of things, and you're going to kind of repeat the process. And while sugar can be very addictive and dopamine inducing, it can also have quite a bad effect on our bodily health in general. It can cause things known as insulin spikes, and too many of them over a compounding period of time will lead to something known as insulin resistance, which is one of the main things that occurs during diabetes. And diabetes can then lead to a whole plethora of other problems like metabolic syndrome and obesity. And sugar is probably one of the main causes of obesity that no one really talks about. Many people think that it's fatty foods and fried foods and all that sort of stuff, which, while it definitely does contribute to the obesity epidemic, it is definitely not the sole cause, and sugar is quite an unknown culprit because, as I say, people are quite addicted to it, and they cope and they say that it's not the cause of their obesity or them being overweight or whatever, and they just say that it's for a little bit of enjoyment, despite the fact that they probably eat way too much of it, because as I've talked about in this section before, it is such an addictive substance, and it needs to be treated by your mindset and philosophy as such. But an easy tip that I can give you in this video to sort of overcome a binge eating and sugar addiction is to eat more satiating foods. Things like white potatoes and complex carbohydrates like oatmeal are so good, for meaning that you're not very hungry for after an hour after you eat that food, compared to when you eat a sugary snack and you're hungry an hour afterwards. Again, when you eat like white potatoes or oatmeal, you're not going to be hungry for another 4 to 5 hours, and that's going to mean that you're probably not going to have the conscious thought of wanting to eat loads and loads of sugary crisps and drinks and snacks in that sort of 4 to 5 hour block. And that will be really, really helpful to you, because it will mean that you end up saving money on all these sugary snacks and sweets, but it will also mean that you do end up having better health. And the other problem with sugar is that in the modern times, in the sort of last 50 years or so, sugar has been marketed like crazy. You know that in supermarket shops, in sort of the little local village shops, sugary sweets, snacks, and all that sort of stuff, they're put right next to the till, so that when you are going to pay for your normal food, which you may have bought, you may end up then buying a few bars of chocolate or packets of sweets for you to then also take home with you, and then you may end up not really buying as much real good food and buy more sugary snacks and sugary drinks and crisps and all that sort of stuff, instead of actually buying whole good foods like the white potatoes, like the oatmeal, that are actually quite satiating. And while the problem is that sugary snacks may seem quite cheap, I mean, a packet of sweets or whatever is like £1, which doesn't really seem like much, but because you are buying so many of these packets of sugary sweets, because they're not really that satiating whatsoever, and you end up going back and back and back to the shops multiple times a day and multiple times a week to get these snacky stuffs, it ends up costing you a lot more money than you may think, despite the fact that for a one-time purchase, sugary snacks and sugary drinks are a very, very cheap thing. And this is another way that companies and big shops and supermarkets and all that sort of stuff, they sort of trick you into buying sugary things because you perceive it as cheap for the one-time purchase, and then when you end up coming back to buy more and more and more of these snacks because you've ended up becoming addicted, you end up spending more money than you normally would if you were just sort of carried on with your normal diet, buying whole foods, white potatoes, the oatmeal that we previously talked about earlier. Yeah, that's why I think that sugar will be a big destroyer of society now as well as in the future, because many people don't even know that it's actually impacting their health. All they do, and they're just sort of coping because it is so potently addictive, and many people don't even really realize how addictive sugar actually is, because it is such a potent stimulant to the brain as well as to the body. And then when you feel the crash afterwards, you end up wanting more sugar, and it just sort of continues in a vicious cycle. And yeah, it's quite a sad thing, and hopefully this can be rid of our world very, very soon. And the second, or really the fifth, main and common destroyer of modern society is video games. And while these are undoubtedly the least harmful to your health, they are also the biggest time waster. And time is something that's very important and finite in our world, and we should probably be valuing our time a little bit higher and not really spending it on playing video games that may just simply be used to sort of kill the time and pass the time, which is not really an attitude and mindset that I recommend you having. One of the easiest ways that you can sort of stop playing video games so much, especially if you're quite addicted and you play it for extended periods of the day, you still say things like, oh yeah, 1 hour per day of video games is fine, but then you end up playing on into the night, one more game and all that kind of stuff. I highly recommend that you take up going to the gym and weightlifting, because the progress that you will see when doing weightlifting consistently, the progress that you will see in your reps and then the weight that you can do will mean that you don't really have to look to video games anymore for a sort of progression. Video games have like those sort of level 1, level 2, level 10, level 100 sort of systems, but weightlifting is something that's so similar, but it's actually something that matters, and it means that if you switch up the habit of playing video games to the habit of working out and weightlifting, you will probably never look back to video games ever, because you simply have replaced one form of progress in video games for another form of progress in the form of weightlifting, where you're making so much progress every week, every month on different weights, different like amount of reps that you can do, maybe adding more sets or new exercises entirely. And because when you're starting out in the gym, you're starting to work out, you're quite new to all this sort of stuff, you will make so much progress initially because your muscles like aren't quite used to that sort of thing. The progress that you will make in the first year or first 6 months even of weightlifting will be so much more compared to the like next 6 months that you'll end up having. Because the amount of muscle that you can build sort of is the opposite to exponential. It's quite quick as you start, and then it sort of slows down. But eventually, by that point that it's slowing down, weightlifting will be such a fun and habitual thing for you that hopefully you will just never ever look back at video games. But to be honest, I feel sorry for some people who are addicted to video games, and while this bit doesn't really apply to the people who play video games for the sort of story, the plot, the characters, and just use it as a bit of a pastime, this really applies to people that are quite addicted to the progress that you find in video games and to the happiness and escapism that many people find inside of video games. Many people may not be living the best lives in school, they may not have good grades, they may not have many friends, and so they turn to video games where they are an absolute god. They may be the best shooter in their league or their rank, they may be at a high rank in the game, and this means they don't really have to care about the real world because, oh, they've got this thing that they're so proud of, that they're so happy of, this achievement that they've got inside the video game. But the problem is that it doesn't mean as much as something that you could have made progress on and done in the real world, such as like building muscle, building a strong and aesthetic body through weightlifting. And that's why I think it's one of the sort of main things that you should replace video games with, because it is quite similar in how the progress actually works. And that is why I think video games are quite the destroyer of modern society, because it provides kids with like this escapism from their life that they may need to improve, and it provides them with the ability to not really face their issues and face their problems. Maybe it's with their body and they're quite overweight, maybe it's with their grades, maybe it's just with social skills and anything that you can possibly imagine. Video games are sort of used by them as an avenue to not face their problems. And while that doesn't apply to everyone, some people just play video games for the sort of social aspect of it. Some people play video games for the fact that they can play it with their friends or whatever. But that doesn't really apply to those types of people. That's not really what this video is for. This video is for those people that sort of use video games as an escapism to not really face their problems. And while you may not really think that actually happens with video games, there are so many examples of people that actually do like think like that. They like video games because it is sort of an escape from reality, and that is the mindset that I used to have. But since weightlifting, I've been far over. I've like not played video games in nearly a year, so yeah, that's pretty good progress personally. But yeah, with that, I hope you found value at this video, and if you did stay to the end, then thank you very much for watching. I highly appreciate it, and I also recommend subscribing because I love this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.